The Butterfly's Dream by Kerberos 314, Chapter 6, Third Person Perspective. Naruto wrote and wrote and wrote some more. He had never written so many words in his entire academic career, not even in his entire life, but he hardly noticed the strain it put on him, the cramps in his wrist, and the late nights which drew him temporarily away from his self-imposed training regimen. There was no pain nor guilt because he had finally found someone he could call a friend, and that was even more important than achieving the recognition of everyone else. But contrary to his promise, he did let it infringe on the time spent with his team. It was clear to two of them that he was constantly being distracted, and to Neji, who it turned out was indeed a boy he suspected, that he was indeed the weakest link. This did nothing to improve their dynamic, which was strained at best and abysmal in many other opinions. On no few occasions, Yamato had hinted that if he didn't pull himself together, then he would be forced to report the behavior to the Hokage. It would only be years later that he would discover that the Jonin had already been updating the old man anyway, and that he only gave Naruto the verbal warning when the situation looked to be untenable. He never got a chance to thank the man for sticking up for him all those times in between. Surprisingly, it had been Ruby who had managed to break him out of his pattern. She too was being harried by outside forces, trying to get her to pay more attention to her own life as her grades began to slip and her father left her with an ultimatum: show improvement or he would pull her out of the fast track program. As delicately as possible, she threatened to cut him off if he didn't do the same. It wasn't like he could hide anything from her, and so he really was given no choice in the matter. No matter how much it hurt to be weaned off his first friend, it would be far worse to lose her entirely. It would be a living hell to be forced to see through her eyes, knowing that she hated him. It never occurred to him that she could not quite him as much as he could not quit her. But the mutual bluff worked. They went back to the usual routine of silently trying to outdo one another, the progress only enhanced by Naruto's new instructor and teammates giving the two of them all sorts of ideas. Ruby decided that she was in love with Tenten. It wasn't honestly sure if she was being literal or figurative. Things went even better for Ruby than they did Naruto. She was not held to any upcoming deadlines, the soonest one being graduation from Signal, projected at 2.5 years from where they were now, and with her improved attitude her father ceased worrying, or at least stopped doing so every waking hour of the day. Her grades stabilized, and she was allowed to stick on in Signal alongside her sister, who couldn't be prouder of her little genius, who still insisted that she was not the bee's knees. She still did not have any people she could call friends, or even truly acquaintances, but with her increased drive and focus on the day-to-day, she felt less reluctant to extend an olive branch when the opportunity presented itself, which it did more and more frequently as she came upon barriers which Naruto could be of no help, and she was forced to reach out to her upperclassmen for advice. She made friends with a few students a year ahead of her in studies, and a good three or four in terms of age, but they didn't seem to mind this discrepancy and encouraged the younger student whenever they could, even going so far as to attend her spars and cheer her on to the almost preatory victory, though she drew the line when the fashion-conscious member of their gang expressed the desire to take her out shopping. She wasn't quite ready for that level of social interaction just yet, but she appreciated the sentiment. She got along better with the fondest among them, her shy personality reminding her of her own, and maybe even a little bit of Naruto's classmate. His classmate cousin, with the way both of them would frequently blush and squeak when trying to express themselves. They were strange, but so was she, and so she was happy for a time. Events in Naruto's life weren't exactly bad in comparison. Honestly, nothing could be quite as miserable as the situation he'd found himself in before becoming a genin, and he shuddered to imagine what would have happened had he never been given access to Ruby's life. He just couldn't boast quite so much progress as his female counterpart, or at least that's the way it felt from his perspective, as the days were occupied half the time by sparring with his unchanging teammates and half doing glorious chores for people who still hated his guts. Tintin was still nice enough to him, and he couldn't help the unconscious attraction he felt thanks to Ruby's obsession with her arsenal of weapons. But Nedzi was another matter. Speaking of, he was currently engaging in a three-way spar with the two of them, and in the midst of dodging a salvo of palm strikes from the aforementioned Pain and the Arse, when his distraction caused him to receive a love tap on his shoulder. He hissed in pain and flashed away in a swirl of red leaves, and the leaves the closest he could get to the mimicking Ruby's semblance thus far. Unlike the girl with predisposition for speed, however, he could not consciously string the acceleration technique together, and so was caught up in a cloud of weapons. The moment he reappeared, cursing both his distraction and lack of aura, he also shot an apology to Ruby on the side for the pain he was causing her. He wiped out his kusarigama and spun the chain around him rapidly in an imitation of what he'd seen his Hyuga teammate do once. It worked well enough for the metal weapons, but did nothing for the lithe Byakugan user who slipped in between the spiral cocoon and attempted to deliver another set of strikes to knock Naruto out of the fight. Not about to let himself be taken down by the same trick so easily, Naruto made to intercept the blocks with his now deployed weapon, and showing that his incredible speed wasn't just due to the Shunshin. Neji never led to his frustration with being unable to hit the planchot, although it did help that he always looked constipated anyways with his dojutsu activated. That was the chief contention between the two to date. The fact that Neji couldn't acknowledge Naruto's comparable strength, continuing to degrade him whenever he lost to the older boy, and citing fate as the sole culprit. Now, Naruto wasn't exactly able to dismiss such a concept, given that it must have been divine intervention which parried him with Ruby, but he was also a staunch believer in personal responsibility, the last few months being irrefutable evidence to this fact. Obviously, he couldn't exactly tell Neji about this, nor would he expect the stuck-up boy to take him on word alone. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he must look insane to anyone else. But that instantly didn't negate the results, and those two were undeniable as Naruto dodged or deflected every one of the other boys' palm strikes with his Kama technique honed through hard work alone. Having been counting the seconds in his head, he flashed away just as one of the strikes was about to land on his chest, reappearing right next to Tenten in midair. The girl tried and failed to hold in her shock as dismissive "eep" escaped her lips, but she quickly drew a ninja toe and blocked the first swing, being sent back and rebounding off a tree before having the blade wrapped up in the chain portion of Uzumaki's weapon. Rather than struggle, she just let go of the disposable sword and drew a pair of sai, jabbing one through a link in the chain and yanking Naruto towards the other. Naruto let himself be dragged through the air, meeting her blade for blade and exchanging a few quick blows before disappearing again in a flurry of rusty leaves, which ended up skewering on her side like marshmallows over an open fire. She felt a rush of wind behind her, which she knew predicted the next attack, but she could do nothing for it as Naruto swept her up in a hook which knocked the wind out of her and sent her flying into the trees, dragging both their weapons along for the ride. Spying the end of the tail chain of the tail-like chain, Naruto reached out and grabbed onto the weighted end of his Kusarigama and wiped it back at Neji, who was trying to take advantage of the distraction. The other boy dodged the scythe stinger easily enough, letting the chain caress his long, burn hair as he ducked in his lightning charge. Naruto cursed and leaped over his first strike, barely dodging the subsequent ones while trying to wrangle the blade portion of his weapon back into his hands. But Neji was not going to let him recover this advantage and had already decided to finish the match before Naruto could either counter or run away yet again. 8 trigrams, Naruto verbally cursed, and Ruby idly noted to chide him for it later. 64 palms. Although it wasn't like she couldn't understand where those dirty words came from, she might have only felt the painful strikes as a dull throb on her subconscious, but she knew that her otherworldly friend would be bearing the full brunt of every blow. Maybe there was an maybe there was an opportune time to swear, and maybe that was it. Neji stood over his prone form, with only the barest hint of triumph across his tense and otherwise stoic face. You should know by now, Uzumaki, that you can't defeat a Hyuga in close quarter battle. Both personalities in the boy's head growled as Neji sneered down at them. Then again, it's doubtful that a one-trick pony like you could learn anything, let alone your place. The pain he felt was deliberating, and he doubted that Neji had held back all that much, if at all, considering how many times he had managed to earn the boy's ire by avoiding that technique. He must have been trying really hard to hit him, and that kick-started his resilience yet again. Naruto knew better than most the difference between feeling like you could do nothing and being capable of doing something. As Neji prepared to rehash his denunciation of those lesser individuals, he was clueless to the chained weapon that was still in Naruto's hand. He had less than a half second by the time he saw Naruto's hand give a small jerk and felt the metal coil around his legs. He toppled over unceremoniously on his rear as the down blonde chuckled painfully. Why you? Whatever insult he had perched on his lips was rudely interrupted by the razor-sharp blade of a simple kunai held close enough to his throat to shave the stunted hairs on his feminine face. Looks like I win, Tenten cried cheerfully, ignoring the murderous glares being sent to her by the one under her blade, and instead choosing to reciprocate the feeble grin on her other teammate's scrunched face. Well done, you three, Yamato congealed from a nearby tree, a sight they tentatively gotten used to over the past few weeks. Good job on seizing the opportunity, Tenten, and well done, Naruto, for creating the opening, as well as resisting their combined attacks for as long as you did. It did not escape notice that he praised everyone but Neji, who was already feeling degraded from being bested with so cheap a trick. Codename Yamato noted the added wrinkles to his Genin's brow when he intentionally excluded him. It was no secret to everyone, including himself, that the boy needed to be taken down a peg or two. On the plus side, he was finally starting to see why Naruto had been deemed ready to graduate early, although he was still convinced that it was the correct decision to place him in charge of watching the boy, lest the fox rear its ugly head prematurely. He was performing a right sight better compared to his unsurprisingly instructor. Whatever had been distracting him seemed to be resolved for now, but he still had yet to find out exactly what that hidden issue might have been, and thus failed that part of the mission. If it was the QB trying to influence the boy, then they might not be out of danger quite yet. His Anbu training would not be getting dull quite so easily. He enumerated a few of their more grievous flaws as they busily collected themselves, Tenten giving the still scowling boy a hand up, and Naruto struggling to remove his face from the dirt. This time Yamato did not spare Neji the criticism, much to the teen's obvious chagrin. He still carefully observed the teen as he reluctantly unsealed enough of Naruto's chakra points that the boy could stand on his own without Tenten's support. So he began after the debriefing, cheer in his voice, hardly spreading to his wooden face. Who's up for a D-rank mission to round up the day? There was mumbles of varying degree of indignation, but none wanted to outright complain about taking on another mission when the promise of a C rank was so close. In the end, they all presented the character unique expressions of consent, mostly wordless and borderline impolite, but Yamato didn't mind. After all, he knew he could always pay them back later. Still, that Anbu training coming in use. That malicious glint went unnoticed to most in their wary state, but a hidden onlooker caught it from their place of perfect vantage, although she could do nothing to warn the others about it, and so elected to sit back and enjoy the misery of others for as long as possible. Soon enough it would be her turn again. Naruto grimaced as he rolled his shoulder, trying to break the irritating feeling of pins and needles which sat under his shoulder blade. He just hoped that Ruby was finding some entertainment out of all this. Although he didn't think that she was the type of person to take a solace with the pain of others, especially when he himself had to restrain a wince every time she found herself harshly slapped down by her uncle, whom Naruto could tell was only pulling his punches as far as necessary to avoid seriously injuring the girl. Not for the first time did he wish he could step in and take the blows on the girl's behalf, but that would be devaluating the entire point of the exercise, not to mention the strength that he knew Ruby to possess. Not much had visibly changed since the first bout with the dusty old crow. It followed mostly the same pattern, with Ruby constantly having to pick herself up off the ground just so that she could charge the man with her best battle cry and be defeated within a few short rounds before finding herself in the same position as when she started. Ready to call it a day, kid? Crow's slighted smirk loomed high over her head, blocking out the sun. Naruto had the urge to berate the older man for underestimating her, but by now knew it was pointless to even try. Besides, Ruby answered for herself, wobbling unsteadily to her feet with a newly christened crescent rose brandished underneath her. How such a scrawny girl could heave such a massive weapon he would never know, but damn if she wasn't envious for their metallurgy. One more. He could feel the strain in her voice. One more time. I'm sure I'll land a hit this time. Keep dreaming, kid. Having already calmed himself down, Naruto didn't bother to get self-righteous at this jib. He could hear the poorly hidden pride behind the man's voice, and had already noticed the vast improvements between that first bout 2 years ago and the culmination today. Crow was still pulling his punches, but not nearly as much as he'd had to before. Watching the way his own sensei moved had given him new appreciation for the vast difference between students and masters. Her uncle clearly fell into the second category, but even if she couldn't see it, she was catching up fast. He ought to let her know that next time he wrote. In fact, she was improving even as the current match wore on. It became obvious that she regained her footing and regarded her uncle with more wariness than before, not rushing in like she had the previous dozen times. The smirk on the older man grew impractically at this newest development, and he agreed to play her game, the two circling one another like hungry beowulfs. Grim were still a pentagram, which Naruto was trying to wrap his head around. Their nature was inconsequential to him, if only because the sheer havoc they would cause in a place like the elemental nations. In Remnant, they seemed to be little more than a nuisance, and he was willing to accept that, but with all the anger and the animosity which was palpable even to him as he wandered the streets in Konoha, a supposedly peaceful village, then what would the Grim see if ever they came to his home world? That was a thought he willingly postponed, just in time to see the two fighters break their preliminary, pre, preliminary statement. Because she was still getting used to working her weapon with gravity dust rounds to boost her speed, Crow thought that when she shot herself at him off mark that it was due to inexperience, fatigue, or both, but immediately when she pivoted on a heel planted firmly in the ground, he knew that he had made a misassumption and had to quickly alter his lazy dodge to a hasty defense. The two blades skittered off one another in a glowing shower of sparks. The older huntsman felt himself excited because this is what he'd been waiting for ever since Ruby unlocked her aura, a chance to go all out. Still, she wasn't there just yet, and he was well aware of the need to take it easy on his two-decade junior, and thus limited his riposte to a horizontal strike, which she blocked easily. As they exchanged blows another couple of times, he gradually increased the pressure, continuing to be impressed when she matched him pound to pound for pound. He tried to catch her off guard with some hand-to-hand, or in this case foot-to-torso, as he lashed out with a nail-driving sidekick when she went high and left her stomach exposed. Not having been witness to her private training, where she tried emulating Naruto's Academy Taijutsu, Crow was justifiably shocked when she moved her knee up to block instead of trying to deflect it with crescent rolls like he expected. Perhaps he was more shocked that she'd hardly budged an inch as his booted heel impacted her bare leg, the only sign that his foot actually connected being a worrying smile on the petite girl's face. As soon as her own foot touched the ground, she spun on her ball with a retaliatory kick, coiling close into her body like a ballerina, which she then unleashed with all the fury of a viper on the other side, forcing the older man to take a half a step back as he blocked. Oh ho! He chuckled excitedly. A hop and a skip brought his other leg up, which was blunt on the shaft of Ruby's scythe, held diagonal across her body. She knocked it back and jabbed at his face with the pommel of her weapon, forcing him to bob and weave between the strikes. Then she dropped down to a crouch and swung at his legs, which was immediately followed by an upward swing when he leaped up to avoid it. Frustratingly, the man managed to deflect that as well as come back at her with an axe kick as he descended to the ground. She was forced on to her back foot, not given a break when subsequently battering strikes rained down on her faster than her 13-year-old body could cope with. She may have been expectantly strong for that age, but it was no comparison to a full-grown adult who simply used the mass of his weapon to bear down upon her. But there was one way she could match it. It was something she'd been working on the same time Naruto had been practicing chakra exercises like tree climbing, which subsequently led to imbuing muscles with the energy for reinforced jumps and strikes. She still hadn't figured out a way to mimic the spider-like powers of the shinobi, but she had discovered the analogous effect to power the body with aura usage. Although she still did not have much energy to spare in that department, at least not compared to her uncle, and certainly not Naruto. At the moment it was either try or face the certain failure of defeat yet again. Both were shocked when her heel was driven into the ground from the hammering strike, but she did not waver, recovering faster than his niece simply due to experience. Crow recommended his blunt strategy and pounded away at her a few more times, just in case it was a fluke. By the fifth ringing interception, it was obvious it wasn't, but before he had time to decide on his next course of action, Ruby had already taken the pause as a signal that it was her turn. Crow's eyes widened as he felt his bones quiver from the incredulously heavy return strike. He saw her raise her arms up for another weighty slash, which would no doubt be every bit as earth-striking as the previous, and so braced herself for the inevitability. It was only after the rose petals clouded his vision that he realized he'd been had, though her semblance may have been speed. Once on the other side of her uncle, she quit using it and slowed to an almost crawl as the strain of her wanton aura used caught up to her. To be honest, even if she'd been at full tilt when attacking her uncle's blind spot, the man was fast enough on his own merit that he probably would have seen her coming anyway, so it was almost expected when he jabbed her in the gut with the butt of his weapon, knocking the wind out of her and sending her to her knees. Whoa, easy there, kid. He caught her as she fell and held her as she struggled to regain her breath with gasping pants. Sorry about that, Ruby. I guess you really almost got the drop on me that time. But she neglected to hear the compliment past her coughing. He rubbed her back with guilt spattering all over his face. He really hadn't meant to hit her that hard. Perhaps if he hadn't been underestimating her from the beginning, he might have been able to catch her before it came to that point. Deep breaths, deep breaths. There you go. Just take it easy, he soothed as best as possible with that gruff voice of his. Uncle Crow, what the what the heck? She glared at him, hands clutching her stomach, which she was sure was bruised underneath the lightly padded strained garment. Yeah, sorry about that again. He rubbed the back of his head, not knowing what else to say, at least until he remembered something else. Won't tell your dad on me, will you? The shaded look which came across her face underneath black, sweaty bangs made him realize he should have just let sleeping dogs lay. The wicked grin which sprouted in those humid conditions told him it was too late for thoughts like that, and he groaned as he contemplated the price of her cooperative silence. All right, he deflected. What do I owe you? His question caused her to glance up at him, keeping that malicious smirk on her face, but after a moment where she had him swelling as much as her, it disappeared in place of something he couldn't recognize. It might have been nostalgia, but he wasn't sure, not expecting to see such an emotion on one so young. She relaxed and leaned against his wiry chest, laying her head on his shoulder, and half buried her face into his ruffled collar. He almost missed the words she mumbled, except that he could feel through his aching bones. Promise you'll never go away. Promise that you'll always be there to help me get strong. He couldn't claim to be comfortable in that situation. Part of the reason he'd never had of his own, but maybe he should have, because right then he was ready to swear the world for her. I promise, he mumbled, giving her a half hug with his right arm and scooping her up with his left. He just marveled with how light she felt, and felt his arms tighten a little more around her scrawling frame. Anything else? He whispered at the top of his head, whiskers getting soaked by the sweat on her scalp. An ice cream, maybe? Strawberry? You got it, kid. Naruto woke the next day feeling as if he'd already run a marathon, but also like he'd finished that marathon completed in Odyssey to end up back in the arms of someone who loved him. End of chapter 6.